Imagine a distant time, a period when the world seemed on the verge of great transformations. In the arid and dusty lands of ancient Judea, a group of ordinary men were called to an extraordinary mission. These men, the 12 apostles, were not religious leaders or figures of power. Many were fishermen, humble workers, without formal education, without prestige. But they were chosen by someone very special. Jesus of Nazareth, the man who attracted crowds with his words of hope and miracles, looked at these men and saw something different. One by one, he called them. Peter, the impulsive and courageous fisherman who would later be known as the Rock of the Church. John and James, the sons of thunder, with their fiery zeal and fierce devotion. Andrew, the silent brother of Peter, always ready to help. Matthew, the tax collector, despised by many but accepted by Jesus. Thomas, the doubter, whose skepticism only made him more faithful in the end. And so, 12 men with distinct stories and personalities, but united by a single cause, to follow the one they believed to be the Son of God. These apostles witnessed miracles, heard teachings that shook the foundations of faith and society, and were shaped by a vision that would transcend the boundaries of their time. Each of them, in their own way, moved from disciple to leader. They didn't know, however, that this journey would lead them to destinies as dark as they were glorious. Their lives, which had been touched by divine presence, would also face the weight of persecution and sacrifice. Yet, while they were with Jesus, there was a light. They not only heard his words, they lived alongside the very incarnation of hope. That hope, however, would be tested in the most brutal way possible. But in that moment, together, the apostles formed a brotherhood, a spiritual fraternity forged in the fire of faith, that would become the foundation of what we call Christianity today. Those 12 men, seemingly ordinary, were destined to become pillars of a belief that would change the course of history. And even after their deaths, their names and stories would resonate through the centuries, reminding us that ordinary men, touched by the divine, can accomplish extraordinary deeds. And so begins our journey through the tragic end of these 12 apostles. But the glow of that hope would begin to fade as soon as Jesus was taken from them, led to Golgotha, crucified, and buried. However, even in the face of their master's death, the apostles did not lose faith. Jesus' resurrection filled them with renewed vigor, and with it came a new mission, to take his message to the ends of the earth. Soon, however, the reality of the mission ahead began to show. The religious and political authorities of the time did not look kindly upon the rise of this new movement. Jesus' name continued to echo, and the growing influence of the apostles caused fear. They openly preached about the resurrection, about a spiritual kingdom, about a God who transcends stone temples. And this, to many, was a threat. The apostles quickly became targets. The first signs of persecution did not take long to arrive. Jerusalem, the city where it all began, became a dangerous place for Christ's followers. Herod the Great had died, but his descendants maintained a firm grip, determined to suppress any insurgency. The religious leaders, in turn, saw in the apostles an uncomfortable continuation of what they believed had ended with Jesus' crucifixion. It was under this climate that the persecution of the apostles began to gain strength. Some were imprisoned, others flogged, and many had to flee to continue preaching. But none of them gave up. They knew that the price of following Jesus' path would not be low, but their determination was unshakable. No longer guided by the physical vision of the Master, they now followed the flame of faith that he had ignited in their hearts. They dispersed throughout the world, each taking the message to foreign lands, knowing that with every step, danger approached. But were they prepared for what was to come? Little did the apostles know that their destinies were about to intertwine with suffering, pain, and martyrdom. What began as a flame of faith would now turn into a bonfire of sacrifices that would illuminate history forever. And so, under the weight of the shadows forming around them, the tragic end of Christ's chosen ones began. Peter, the ever-impetuous apostle, now found himself at the head of a movement that grew more each day. In Jerusalem, he preached with fervor, his voice echoing through the streets, attracting crowds. But with the attention came dangers as well. Peter knew that the powerful were watching him. The shadow of imprisonment was always near, but he continued, undeterred, carrying forward the message of Jesus. In Rome, Peter found fertile ground for preaching, but also a ruthless city. The capital of the empire was a mix of wealth, decadence, and cruelty. It was here that he would face his final destiny. Nero, the mad emperor, had found in the Christians the perfect scapegoat for the fire that devastated Rome in 64 AD. Under his command, the persecution of Christians was fierce and relentless. Peter was arrested and condemned to death. But Peter was not just another prisoner. He was the leader of the new faith, the man whom Jesus had said would be the rock upon which his church would be built. When the time came for his execution, Peter made a singular request. He did not consider himself worthy to die in the same way as his master. And so, Peter was crucified upside down, in an act of humility that only underscored his unbreakable faith. He had been the first to proclaim Jesus as the Christ, and now, with his death, he sealed forever his place as one of the pillars of Christianity. Peter's blood, spilled on the streets of Rome, marked the beginning of a new era of sacrifices. His death was not the end, but the beginning of a path that many others would follow, a path that would lead the apostles to different corners of the world, all destined to find glory through martyrdom. And so, Rome became the stage for the first great sacrifice among the apostles, with Peter leaving behind a legacy that would echo for millennia, inspiring all those who, like him, believed in the promise of life beyond death. While Peter's blood still dried under the relentless Roman sun, another giant of Christian faith was facing his own destiny, Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles. Though he was not one of the original 12, his dramatic transformation from persecutor to spreader of Christ's message had placed him among the most important and influential followers of Jesus. Paul was a singular figure, known for his tireless determination and ability to unite diverse communities through his letters and preaching. He had traveled extensively, taking Christianity to distant lands, challenging cultural and religious barriers, preaching in synagogues and public squares, in markets and prisons. His faith was unyielding, even in the face of countless dangers, stonings, shipwrecks, imprisonments. Nothing could dissuade him from his mission. But, like Peter, Paul knew that the end was near. After years of imprisonment, he was finally taken to Rome. The empire considered him a threat, and Nero, eager to suppress any dissent, ordered his execution. However, as a Roman citizen, Paul received a less agonizing death than Peter. Instead of being crucified, he was beheaded, a quick execution but loaded with symbolism. On the outskirts of Rome, along the Via Ostiensis, Paul knelt. Perhaps, in that moment, his thoughts returned to the road to Damascus, where everything had changed for him. That blinding light, the voice of Jesus that had transformed him forever. Now, he was about to complete his journey. With a swift stroke, the executioner's sword fell, and Paul's head rolled, but his faith remained intact, his message continued to resonate through the generations. With his death, Christianity lost one of its greatest intellectuals and visionaries, but Paul's sacrifice was another seed planted in the fertile soil of martyrdom. Like Peter, he knew that his life was just a chapter in something much greater, something that would transcend his time and his death. Paul would become the symbol of Christianity's expansion beyond Jewish borders, a man whose conviction and passion would carry the faith to all corners of the empire and beyond. And so, with Paul's death, the empire showed itself to be ruthless, but the apostles' spirit continued to grow. While Rome witnessed the martyrdom of Peter and Paul, in Jerusalem, another tragedy had already occurred, marked by brutality and the urgency to silence the voice of one of the apostles closest to Jesus, James, the son of Zebedee. Known as the first martyr among the 12, James faced his end with a courage that would echo through the centuries, making him a symbol of unshakable faith. James, along with his brother John, formed the duo known as the Sons of Thunder. They were passionate, fervent, and at times, impetuous, always by Jesus' side in crucial moments. After Christ's resurrection, James dedicated his life to preaching the word, establishing himself as one of the main voices of the nascent church in Jerusalem. But his impact did not go unnoticed. Herod Agrippa I, the grandson of Herod the Great, was determined to maintain control over his region, and the growth of the Christian movement represented a threat to the stability he so desired. In an attempt to appease Jewish leaders and reinforce his power, Herod turned his attention to the apostles. James became his target. In a political and religious blow, James was captured and brought before Herod. Without delay, he was condemned to death. Unlike Peter, whose life would be spared for a short time, James had no escape. His execution was swift and brutal, beheaded by the sword in the heart of Jerusalem, under the stern gaze of those eager to silence the message of Jesus. James' death was a shock to the Christian community. He had been one of the first to follow Jesus, one of those who witnessed his transfiguration and his agony in Gethsemane. Now, his blood was shed as the first of many sacrifices to come. But even in the face of this loss, the apostles did not retreat. James' death marked the beginning of a more intense persecution in Jerusalem, but it also strengthened the resolve of the other apostles. They knew their lives were in danger, but they had a purpose greater than themselves that transcended death. Thus, James' martyrdom became another symbol of the sacrifice necessary to carry the faith forward. James' head was cut off, but his message and courage lived on in each of his brothers in faith who, inspired by his example, continued to spread the light of the gospel even as the darkness of persecution loomed. While the news of James' death reverberated among Christ's followers, another apostle continued his journey of faith, facing dangers and challenges in distant lands. Andrew, Peter's brother, the one who had been the first called by Jesus, walked tirelessly, taking the gospel beyond the borders of Israel. Unlike many other apostles, Andrew traveled to less explored regions, preaching in the lands of Greece and areas near the Black Sea. With a quieter and more contemplative nature, Andrew was not one to seek the spotlight, but his faith was deep, and his devotion unquestionable. He spoke of Christ to everyone he encountered, even knowing that his message could be seen as an affront by local rulers and religious leaders. It was in the city of Patras, Greece, that Andrew's fate was sealed. His preaching had begun to attract crowds, and this angered the local authorities, particularly the proconsul Aegeas. The ruler, irritated by Andrew's growing influence and determined to maintain order, ordered his arrest. For Aegeas, the message of a man who had been crucified as a criminal and, supposedly, resurrected, was an intolerable threat to his power and traditional beliefs. Andrew was condemned to crucifixion, but, like his brother Peter before him, he made a request. He did not consider himself worthy to die in the same way as Jesus. Instead, he was condemned to be tied, not nailed, to an X-shaped cross, prolonging his suffering. For 2 days, Andrew remained hanging on that cross, his body slowly weakening, but his voice continuing firm. Even while tied to the cross, Andrew did not stop preaching. The stories say that those who passed by him heard his words, witnessing the strength of his faith, and many converted right there, at the foot of his cross. His last words were of hope, encouraging those around him to keep the faith alive, just as he had done until his last breath. On the 3rd day, Andrew's life extinguished. His body was taken down from the cross, but his soul had already found rest. He had fulfilled his mission and joined his brothers in martyrdom, leaving behind the symbol of his X-shaped cross, which would come to be known as St. Andrew's Cross. With his death, another apostle gave his life for the gospel, and the blood spilled by Andrew became yet another seed for the flourishing of Christianity in distant lands. Thus, even tied to that cross, Andrew remained free in spirit, his voice echoing through the hearts of those he touched, and his memory living on in the history of the Christian faith. While Andrew's body rested under the shadow of the X-shaped cross, the words of another apostle echoed miles away, in the hot and mysterious lands of the East. Thomas, the apostle whose faith was initially marked by doubt, now walked with conviction through a strange land, taking Christ's message to the far corners of India. Thomas, the apostle who doubted and needed to see Christ's wounds to believe in the resurrection, had transformed. His initial doubt gave way to a powerful and fearless faith, a faith that led him to travel farther than any other apostle. He ventured along the trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to the east, preaching to people who had never heard of Jesus. In India, he found a land rich in culture and spirituality, but also a land where his words represented a break with established traditions. Thomas soon gained followers, converting not only the poor but also members of royalty. Tradition tells that he was welcomed by a local king, and through his teachings and miracles, many were baptized. But just as in other places, his growing influence began to trouble those who felt threatened by his message. Thomas knew danger was near, but he did not retreat. His mission was greater than the fear of death. And then, on a fateful day, he was captured by local priests who saw him as a threat to the power of their ancient beliefs. They condemned him to death, not by crucifixion, but by an equally cruel fate. Thomas was taken to a rocky hill, where soldiers wielding spears surrounded him. Even in the face of his destiny, Thomas did not renounce his faith. He knew that his doubts had been overcome, and now he embraced martyrdom with the same conviction that had sustained his journeys. The soldiers advanced, and their spears repeatedly pierced his body. With each blow, Thomas grew closer to the end, but in his final breaths, he still praised the name of Christ. Thomas died there, under the open sky of India, his body marked by spears, but his spirit freed from the doubt that had once bound him. His blood, like that of his apostle brothers, nourished the soil where new seeds of faith would flourish. Although his life ended at that moment, Thomas's presence in India became part of the local Christian tradition. Christian communities, known as St. Thomas Christians, emerged and continue to honor his memory to this day. The apostle who doubted, but who in the end believed with all his being, turned his disbelief into a flame of faith that crossed continents and centuries. And so, with Thomas's martyrdom, another flame of faith was extinguished on earth, but the fire of Christ's message continued to burn brightly in every corner of the world. While Thomas's blood mixed with the soil of India, the sacrifices of other apostles were taking place in distant lands, each facing their own destiny with the same unshakable faith. Bartholomew, also known as Nathanael, had traveled far to spread Christ's message. He preached fervently in the regions of Armenia and Mesopotamia, places where Christian faith was still a fragile seed amid lands dominated by ancient beliefs and ruthless powers. Bartholomew, known for his sincerity and deep devotion, had become a respected figure for his healings and miracles, but this also attracted unwanted attention from religious and political leaders. In one of those places, his preaching directly challenged the dominant religion, provoking the wrath of local rulers who saw Bartholomew as a threat to their power and faith. The apostle was captured on charges of blasphemy and witchcraft, and the trial was as swift as it was merciless. His punishment would be one of the most brutal among all the apostles. Bartholomew was sentenced to be flayed alive. The horror of this execution turned him into a symbol of resistance and faith. Even as his flesh was stripped away, Bartholomew did not renounce his belief, his voice praying as his body was subjected to unimaginable suffering. Finally, his martyrdom was completed when he was beheaded, and his soul, already freed from his tortured body, found rest alongside his master. At the same time, in another part of the world, Philip, the apostle whose words had convinced so many hearts to follow Christ, faced his own trial. Philip had taken the gospel to the lands of Asia Minor, and it was in the city of Hierapolis, in modern-day Turkey, that he met his final resistance. Philip had directly challenged the local gods and the powerful interests by preaching Christ, and this provoked the wrath of the city's rulers. The population, instigated by pagan priests, demanded his execution. He was captured and brought to be crucified upside down, an execution that reflected that of his brother Peter. Bound to the cross, Philip continued to pray, and even in his last moments, he pleaded for the conversion of those who watched him. Miraculously, in the midst of his suffering, something happened. The accounts say that an earthquake shook the city, opening cracks in the ground that swallowed some of those present. Alarmed, many of the citizens fell into repentance, recognizing the strength of Philip's words. But for the apostle, it was already too late. His life was extinguished on the cross, but his legacy endured in those who converted that day. Bartholomew and Philip, both crucified in their own forms of martyrdom, turned their sufferings into living testimonies of faith. Their deaths were not in vain, for in every land they passed through, Christians emerged, inspired by the courage and unwavering devotion of the apostles. They were more than men, they were bearers of a light that, even when extinguished by death, continued to shine in the hearts of those who believed. And so, with Bartholomew and Philip, two more apostles met their tragic end, but not before planting the seeds of Christianity in the lands they visited, leaving an eternal mark on the fabric of faith. As the shadows of martyrdom enveloped the apostles one by one, others continued their mission, aware that destiny awaited them. Jude Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Matthias, the apostle chosen to replace Judas Iscariot, all faced their own trials in distant lands, but with the same spirit of devotion that guided their brothers. Jude Thaddeus, known for his fervent preaching, had traveled to Mesopotamia and Persia. He persistently shared the word of Christ, challenging established religions and facing local authorities. But his popularity and impact did not go unnoticed. In Persia, Jude Thaddeus and Simon the Zealot, who often preached together, were captured. The two apostles found themselves caught in the middle of a conflict with pagan priests, whose temples and beliefs were being abandoned in favor of Christianity. The Persian rulers, enraged by the growing number of conversions, saw Jude and Simon as a direct threat to the spiritual and political power of the region. They were judged and condemned to a cruel and violent death. Jude Thaddeus was beaten to death with a heavy club, each blow attempting to silence the voice that had preached hope and redemption. Simon, on the other hand, suffered an equally brutal fate. He was sawn in half, a symbol of the relentless hatred against Christ's message. Even in the face of such cruelty, Jude and Simon never renounced their faith. They died as they had lived, proclaiming Christ until their last breaths, knowing their sacrifice would be part of something much greater than their own lives. Their bodies were left as a testament to the hatred they faced, but also as a reminder of the faith that never bowed to earthly power. And then there was Matthias, the one chosen by the apostles to fill the place left by Judas Iscariot after his betrayal. Matthias, though lesser known, played a crucial role in the spread of Christianity. He preached in Jerusalem and later traveled to the regions of Ethiopia and the Caspian Sea. He took Christ's message to people who had never heard of the Savior, but his preaching also attracted persecution. Like his brothers, Matthias faced his tragic end with courage. In Jerusalem, he was captured by the same religious powers that had condemned Jesus and James. Matthias was dragged out of the city and, without mercy, stoned to death. His execution was brutal, but in his final moments, Matthias kept his eyes fixed on heaven, as if knowing he would soon be reunited with those who had walked alongside Jesus. With the deaths of Jude Thaddeus, Simon, and Matthias, the circle of apostles was almost complete. One by one, they had given their lives, not for wealth or glory, but for the message of a kingdom that transcended the earthly world. Their bodies were broken and destroyed, but the legacy they left was indestructible. Christianity, planted in their blood, was flourishing in the most unlikely lands, and the light of Christ, which they carried until the end, shone ever brighter with each sacrifice. And so, the number of remaining apostles dwindled, but their mission, spirit, and faith never disappeared, nourished by the lives they had transformed and the message they had proclaimed to the end. Now, with almost all the apostles having given their lives in martyrdom, their lives sacrificed in the name of the faith they had embraced, only their legacy remained, a legacy forged in the fire of suffering and in the blood spilled in distant lands. Each of them, with their unique stories and tragic destinies, had contributed to something that would surpass their own ends. Christianity, the message of Christ they took to the world, was taking root in every corner of the empire and beyond, despite the persecutions, violence, and fear they had faced. In truth, the tragic end of the apostles was not the end of everything but the beginning of something even greater. Their deaths served to cement the strength and authenticity of the message they had preached. Their lives, lived with fervor and dedicated to a cause greater than themselves, became a testimony that would transcend generations. Each martyrdom, each suffering, instead of silencing the faith, inflamed the hearts of those who saw in them an example to follow. Behind their deaths, a deeper truth rose. The apostles knew that Christ's message was not destined to remain confined to an isolated corner of the world but to cross borders and withstand the power of empires. Their sacrifice carried a conviction that the world could not destroy, that eternal life surpassed the fear of death, that the resurrection was a living promise. Each of them, with their final breaths, confirmed that the cross was not a defeat but a spiritual victory. And so, what began with a small group of men around Jesus of Nazareth, fishermen, tax collectors, zealots, became the foundation of a faith that would spread to all nations. The world would never be the same. Those men, whose lives intertwined in stories of pain and triumph, were transformed into symbols of perseverance, faith, and love. The apostles, with their deaths, gave rise to the tradition of martyrs, whose faith would transform the world irreversibly. The message of Christ, which they proclaimed with their voices and sealed with their blood, would continue to echo, growing and flourishing even in the darkest of times. The end of their lives was not the end of their mission, on the contrary, it was the spark that set the world ablaze with a new light, a light that shone with the promise of redemption and hope. And so, at the edges of time and history, the sacrifice of the apostles became the cornerstone of a new era, an era that endures to this day. Their names and stories are remembered not only as martyrs but as heroes of faith, whose lives echo in every church, every prayer, and in every heart that embraces the message they once carried. The tragic end of the apostles, ultimately, was the beginning of Christianity as we know it, a faith that, like them, would never yield to death but would find its true life in the midst of eternity.